All right, so good morning. Today, we are going to be discussing the physical readiness training pillar aspect of H2F, or in this case, CTAS. And the primary focus in this pillar is going to be optimizing physical performance. So with this, we're going to be covering how you're going to go about designing physical readiness training programs for yourself, teaching your soldiers how to do it for them, and then how you can do this for your unit. So this initial class is going to discuss the aspects of an individual day's training program. So how do you look at the variables that are going to be construed in that singular day? Later on, we're going to expound upon this into how do you look at your METs and then do a biomechanical analysis of your METs in order to modify your unit's training program to meet the same physical capacity as that. And then we'll expound from that even further on how you do periodization, which means how do you take the training variables from a day-to-day basis and turn that into week-to-week to month-to-month. Now, we'll be discussing all of that within this block of instruction, but again, the primary purpose of this one is just to go over the critical components of a singular day's variables when you're going to be programming. And this is going to be different, of course, if you're out on the track, on a bike, or in the gym. This one in particular is going to be focusing on resistance training, but we'll hit all of those as we go through. And as we're covering the information in this clinic, as always, if I say something that makes you think of anything to do with your normal programming, or you have any type of question, even if it is with how does this apply to running, or how does this apply to a unit or to my soldiers in this specific situation, right? Such as you may have a soldier that's a single mother of three. How would changing these variables accommodate for that individual? Right, so this is obviously the best time and place to be able to ask those questions. So please, please, please feel free to interrupt me if you do have a question. For those of you that are joining digitally, I do have the screen up to be able to see if you raise your hand. So you can either feel free to interrupt me with a question or raise your hand and I will accommodate thusly. But let's move forward. All right, so to begin with, it looks like there's a lot on screen already, but these are the base variables that pertain to resistance training program design. Now, what's interesting is these are the same metrics quantitatively that are put in almost every single exercise science textbook. So if you or your soldier was going to get an undergraduate degree or graduate degree in exercise science, whether that's through kinesiology, going toward physical therapy, or what have you, this is the same information you're going to be presented. For those of you that are already trying to work toward your TSAC-F, your Tactical Strength and Conditioning Facilitator certification through the National Strength and Conditioning Association, or your certified personal trainer, etc. Again, this is the same exact information you're going to use. And what I like most about those variables is the fact that as of October 1st, 2020, right, so we're approaching now almost 2 years, that big chart that makes up the majority of the screen, that's in the new FM7-22. If you haven't read the new FM, obviously I highly recommend it for holistic health and fitness, but it has program design chapters and it has periodization chapters. This particular chart is taken from, as you can see the annotation, chapter 4, figure 4-1 on PDF page 47, and it covers the continuum of focuses that you can have for resistance training. So if you or your soldiers were going to go to the gym, which hopefully you do after you or they start to realize the importance of that type of physical training for our occupation and overall health, you get to see that there's really only 4 different training goals, primary training goals, that resistance training can be comprised of. Either that individual is trying to increase their muscular endurance, they're trying to well, and let's define that for a moment. What do you think of when I say the words muscular endurance with regards to physicality and performance?
Basically, how long can you perform certain activities?
Okay, so how long you can perform certain activities? Good. What do you think, Sergeant Watts?
Pretty much like general conditioning, I guess.
Okay, general conditioning, that's good. So both of those are accurate. depending on what form of literature you're looking at, most muscular endurance forms of training or calisthenic falls under these as well. A lot of lower intensity, high volume training is how we quantify muscular endurance. But the reason that you would do that type of training is to be able to increase your overall stamina, so how much volume that you can perform a certain pattern with. So you think of things like a pull-up, right? If you want to be able to increase the number of pull-ups that you can do, it is not a strength component. It is not a hypertrophy or power component, the other three variables you see on screen. That is a muscular endurance component. Same thing with the hand release push-up for the Army Combat Fitness Test, right? Those are endurance-based aspects. Now, there is a significant difference between muscular endurance and aerobic endurance or anaerobic endurance. The latter two, aerobic and anaerobic endurance, are part of cardiovascular training. And when we do cardiovascular training, our primary focus is trying to correlate the intensity of our heart rate with our overall energy system that's going to be used, which we've covered in a prior physiology class, but we'll cover again in another class when we reapproach that. But to give you a brief example, if you were going to be doing sprints at around 60 to 90 seconds, you would be training your anaerobic glycolysis system or fast glycolysis. And that should correlate to your training heart rate within that, right? So you want about an 80 to 95% of your overall training heart rate. Once you can kind of mirror those two things together with proper work to rest ratio, you'll be training anaerobically in order to get better at that activity, whether that's swimming, biking, running, etc. However, with resistance training, the point is to try and hit a certain type of volume goal with minimal recovery and to hit the similar volume goal either in a singular set or in multiple sets. So the way you'll read this at the top, you see that there's fiber type along the kind of the upper x-axis, and then the bottom it tells you resistance with a percentage of 1 rep max. That percentage of 1 rep max correlates with the approximate repetitions on the left side of the chart, and then the relative rest period that is recommended on the right side of the chart. So if you look at the endurance block, this tells you that if you were training toward muscular endurance, the primary muscle fiber type you would use is your slow twitch muscle fibers, or type 1. Endurance training is typically done in excess of 15 repetitions. So per working set, you'd be able to move that weight 15 or more times. The correlating percentage of 1 rep max to 15 is 65%. In other words, if you were able to do 15 repetitions of a movement, whether that is squat, bench, deadlift, etc., and with you had no repetitions in reserve, so 0 RIR, that would be your approximate 15 rep max, which would be approximately 65% of your 1 rep max. That's how you would read that chart. And then each set, if you were doing that, you'd want to rest between 30 and 45 seconds, or less than that 30 to 45 seconds. Okay. Now, again, that's when you want to be able to increase local muscular endurance. So something where you want to be able to do more repetitions, right? More leg tucks, more push-ups, etc. This does not directly correlate to cardiovascular endurance. And the reason that is because when you train cardiovascularly, again, regardless of your mode, swimming, biking, running, hiking, foot marching, whatever you like to do, true cardiovascular endurance should not have a muscular limitation. So to further refine that, if you are running and you feel that you have some type of muscular skeletal deficiency, in other words, your legs are what's getting tired. You feel the soreness or tightness, blood pooling in the lower third of your tibia or on the top of your foot, right, the dorsal compartment of your foot, something on those nature. When you're trying to run, maybe it's your shoulders or trapezius getting tired with a foot march. If you have some type of musculoskeletal deficiency, that's actually limiting you from reaching your cardiovascular threshold to actually improve your cardiovascular training for the most part. So when you do cardio, you absolutely should not have some type of muscular limitation. Questions so far? All right, so moving on from that, if you increased the intensity, which means when you increase the intensity, you actually lower the volume. They have an inverse relationship with training programs. You would move into hypertrophy. Now, we've kind of discussed this before, but just to see your understanding of it, how would you define hypertrophy? All right, having no idea is a fair goal. What do you think, Sergeant Watts?
Hypertrophy is pretty much stimulates muscle growth.
Good, good. Hypertrophy is when you increase the cross-sectional area of muscle. The best way to think about this isn't necessarily getting big, which is what most people think about when they think about gaining muscle. Hypertrophy is when you want to focus on your body composition. So this can mean getting big. This can also mean leaning out. If you have an individual that is on the Army Body Composition Program, for an example, they are overweight or obese, and they want to be able to increase their lean mass, which means they'll be decreasing their fat mass, just simply by that correlation, they would want to do hypertrophy. So I really like to focus on it like this. If I have an individual that is overweight or obese, and they want to, good morning, Sergeant Boyer, and they want to be able to modify their body composition, and the same time, I have another soldier, another client that wants to walk on stage and actually compete in a bodybuilding, physique, or figure competition. Realistically, they have the same exact goal. The specifics of their goal as far as how much of the body composition that needs to change and the intensity and frequency they'll be training at due to their actual training age will be vastly different. But overall, the training goal is the same. And it's often not treated like this. Typically, we see people that are overweight and obese, and we get them to do cardiovascular training, right? Something that people would consider easy and light to focus on weight loss. And to be honest, I'm not really a fan of the term weight loss because it misconstrues psychologically the goal that that person should be focusing on and can typically set them up for failure if they don't understand a lot of these program design variables. If someone wants to lose weight, they realistically want to try and teach their body to focus on gaining muscle. All right, so again, that doesn't mean getting bigger. It just means giving the body the information so that its focus based on its nutrient intake, its rest, and everything else that you do focuses on the lean tissue versus the adipose tissue. Okay, so then we get that through hypertrophy. So this chart shows that hypertrophy predominantly uses your type 2A muscle fibers. That's the top of the chart. Between 8 and 12 repetitions, which is on the left side of the chart, which equates to approximately 60 to 85% every 1 rep max, and then the rest period of 1 to 3 minutes. I do want to state that although this is the general number ranges used on almost every single textbook, most forms of meta-analysis for hypertrophy have shown you can have a hypertrophic effect anywhere between like 30% intensity to 85, 90% intensity. Hypertrophy has the largest range of adaptations. The reason why textbooks typically list hypertrophy between 8 and 12 is because if you get into the sub 12 range as far as endurance, right? So you're doing more than 12 repetitions. So when I say sub 12, I mean less intensity. So if you can do more than 12 repetitions, right? You're doing the 15 or more, the information your body's taking from that is typically to improve its endurance, not necessarily to improve its overall composition. If you're working at a higher intensity, so you're working at 6 reps or less, you may be telling your body to improve strength instead of improving composition. And that key difference is extremely, extremely important because exercise itself isn't the best thing for overall weight loss, right? As we were kind of discussing before. But what it does is it teaches your body how to use the nutrient information and the rest information moving forward. Right? So when you go into the gym and you're moving a certain intensity for a certain amount of repetitions in a certain movement pattern, you're telling your body to focus on increasing its capability in this particular paradigm. And that paradigm is either going to be endurance, hypertrophy, power, or strength. depending on the intensity you train at, the amount of rest you give yourself, and then how often you actually train that activity, right? The consistency of that activity. Any questions on those concepts or on hypertrophy? All right, so power. You'll notice something very specific about power, in which it's the only one in a block, and it kind of works as a Venn diagram on here, right? So you see it fits somewhat into hypertrophy range and somewhat into strength range. And this is because power is a very, very, very special type of training. Power training is typically only seen in your Olympic lifts, right? So clean, snatch, jerk. And this is because power is strength training, so intensities at movements at very high intensity, but they cannot be done slowly. Right, so you cannot do a high intensity clean, snatch, jerk, or push press in a slow manner. You require a high amount of acceleration, a high amount of initial velocity in order to create enough momentum to move that weight in whatever that pattern is. So if you have strength plus speed, that's power. Most of the time when you're doing power training, you're going to be working at sub 1 rep max loads. Because you need that speed component, you'll typically be moving around 70 to 75% for most training days. You may get up to 80 to 85% if you're doing peak, and then close to your 90 when you get closer to the competition. So that's why it gets into the hypertrophy range, right, which would be that sub 85% intensity. But for the most part, it's just those 4 primary core lifts, right, clean, snatch, jerk, and push press, but they have to be done quickly. Now, all these movements are critical for overall physical performance, especially as a tactical athlete. They're very rarely trained because they're extremely technical. And unless you have someone that can coach that person, and that coach has a lot of experience in being able to mitigate musculoskeletal injuries and being able to refine that, then there's a high risk of injury with regards to these movement patterns, right? Simply due to lack of training age. But power is very important, and it's something that I wish a lot more soldiers would train, right? Because it's more practical. If you needed to be able to throw a rucksack, you need to be able to, basically throw anything, be able to get over an obstacle quickly, help one of your teammates over an obstacle. And of course, this is talking about the tactical pieces, the environment, but even in DISCA, right? For if we're responding to a hurricane or responding to an earthquake, you need to be able to move a piece of debris quickly, help someone in and out of a situation. A lot of those require strength plus speed to be able to modify that appropriately, right? Or to be able to have that proper adaptation. So it's very important to be able to train these. And if I can make a key distinction at this time, generally, our soldiers that don't train strength and they don't train to lift something heavy, a lot of times because they're either afraid of it or they think that's not for them, right? They may think, why do I need to be able to lift 140 pounds in a deadlift? Why do I need to be able to lift 200 pounds or move this? That's not something I've ever done as a human resource NCO, or that's something I've never done as a laundry and bath specialist or as a military police, right? But what they typically tend to forget is that there's a difference between, critical task and common task. Your common tasks are your day-to-day. That's what you're going to be doing in your normal occupational specialty, or during annual training, during a normal battle assembly, or in general. But our common tasks that we keep up with are not the life and death situations, right? If you needed to be able to move a vehicle right now, pull someone out of a firefight, or help someone over a wall, those are those critical, those less than 1% opportunities where you need it, or your life or someone else's life could be in danger. And it really doesn't matter what your MOS is or what your normal duty is. Every single one of us sign up to be a soldier, right? And we put on the same uniform. And you need to be ready for that emergency event, not just for your normal day-to-day. And training power and training strength help you for those critical tasks, right? Those less than 1% opportunities. So I think that's a very important distinction to make when you are discussing these things with your soldiers. You're trying to apply overall purpose to these movements. Any questions so far? How can you mix what?
Every single one of them.
Ah, that's a critical question. So what if you have an individual that wants to look good, right? Hypertrophy, move fast, be power, move heavy things, such as strength, and then do that a lot, which is endurance. So the key to mixing these, or the key to trying focusing on all of them, is really where periodization becomes important. So periodization is, how do you look at these variables and look at a long-term picture, maybe an 8-week, 10-week, or 4-month, 6-month, etc. program, and learn how to fluctuate these variables so that you can continually increase in each. But what you do not want to do, for the most part, what you don't want to do is to have all of these in a singular training session. Right? When you give your body that much information, you're not making it specific to what you want to get better at. So if you have intensity for endurance and intensity for hypertrophy and intensity for strength all in the same training session, what you're going to adapt from is going to be very minimal. Right? Sometimes people go in the gym and they think they're doing good because they're getting sore, they're getting tired, right? They get with their unit, whether it's with a squad or a platoon, and they're doing physical readiness training, and the intensity is hard, right? It's difficult. They're doing high intensity interval training, they're pushing themselves, they're breathing hard, and they think they got something in and it was good. But for the most part, a lot of times individuals do that and they introduce that damage to their body and they get practically nothing out of it. And this is because they're not hitting the specific training variables necessary for improvement. And that comes from specificity, which means you look at the movement pattern you want to do and you do it. If you know you need to pick something off the ground, what exercise do you need to do? What do you think? Not a squat. It's common misinterpretation. Go ahead, Sean Watts.
Deadlift.
Good. A deadlift or a lunge. Those are your two biomechanical patterns to lift something off the ground. If you needed to lower something to the ground or control your own body weight, right? So say you're going to be sitting on a toilet, sitting on a couch, or lowering into a specific position, that would be a squat. If you needed to create close quarter space, push someone away from you, you would focus on what type of movement pattern?
Bench press.
Good. Bench press or push up, right?
Push up.
Or maybe a medicine ball toss in front of you. The same motion of getting someone away from you, that horizontal adduction, that, for utilizing your pectoralis major, extension of your triceps, or extension of your elbow, excuse me, in order to contract your triceps, that carries over to a bench press or a push-up. So we have to look at what tasks do we need, right? If you're going to be carrying water hoses, carrying a water heater, and things of those nature, you would be doing either a farmer carry or a suitcase carry, right? So we look at the movements that we need to be able to do, and then we correlate those movements to some type of exercise, and then we get specificity. That's the first variable. Second variable is overload, which tailors to intensity. So if you needed to be stronger, then your intensity should be 85% or greater, which means you should be training at 6 reps or less. If you needed to train endurance, then you would be training at greater than 15 reps, right, with less than 45 seconds of rest. And if you needed to train power, then you'd need that strength plus speed component we discussed earlier. That would be the specificity and the overload. The third variable, which is very important, is progression, which means if you're training at, say, 185 pounds for 5 reps in week 1, you may want to try and increase anywhere between 5 to 15 pounds in the next week, depending on training age and where you are in your training program. And you want to continuously do that until you can't improve anymore and you plateau, right? That's your progressive overload, right? If you don't have those 3 variables, specificity, overload, and then that progression for the progressive overload, then you won't necessarily give your body the information to get better. So often when people just go to do something to get tired, they're doing HIIT training, but they're arbitrarily hitting reps, right? They're doing something for a certain amount of time, and they're not necessarily tracking these quantitative variables in order to get better. then they're just increasing damage and they're getting fatigued, but they're not telling your body, this is what I want to get better at. Does that answer your initial question for that Stormboard? Good. And then kind of the last piece is strength, right? So strength means you're going to be moving slow, you're going to be moving something heavy, and you're going to be increasing your body's ability to move heavy things. If you want to get stronger, training in endurance, training in hypertrophy won't get you strong for the most part. If you have someone that's never really lifted weights before and they do anything, they're going to get better. But the key thing is not just to do anything. I'm a huge advocate of, if you're going to be spending that limited amount of time training, even if it's just 20 minutes in the gym, why not get the most out of the time that you're in the gym? So I really don't like when people say at least someone's doing something, right? At least they're moving, because they're already spending the time to exercise. So why would you spend that time exercising and not make sure you can get the most out of it? Right. We'll get a little bit more into that when we get to the exercise selection piece. The last piece I wanted you to use here as a reference moving forward on the right side of the screen would be a correlation chart between percentage of 1 rep max and repetition. And this is very important when you do assessments. So if you get into the gym right now and you did deadlift, you did 8 repetitions and you had no RIR, right? No repetitions in reserve. If that was 155 pounds, as example, was your 8 rep max. And if you took that 155 pounds and you divided it by 80%, which you see to the right, or excuse me, to the left of 8, that'll give you your approximate 1 rep max. Once you have that number, you can use that to program for the rest of your entire muscle cycle, right? For the rest of your entire month or 2 or 3 months. But if you don't have that number, you're shooting in the dark. Right, that means you may never hit that overload piece in order to actually get better. Questions, comments?
When you say no reps in reserve, is that you can't do anymore.
Exactly. That means that even if I put a gun to your head, you couldn't have done another rep. Right, maximal effort. Good. So let's take that and get to the actual steps of designing a program. So this is something we've shown before in periodization. We're going to get a little bit more in depth on it. When you are designing a program, whether it's for resistance training or running, or cardiovascular, I should say, you have the same 8 steps to design this program. Same 8 primary critical components. Now the specifics of those components will change whether you're doing musculoskeletal or whether you're doing cardiovascular. But in general, you have the same 8 steps. So step 1 is always the needs analysis, right? But if you're going to design a program, you need to know, what is the goal of that program? What is your end state? Where do you want to be? Right? If your soldier wants to just pass a 2-mile run, or do they have a certain goal component of that 2-mile run? Do soldiers just want to be able to, again, pass the deadlift, or do they want to be able to improve upon that deadlift? Unless your soldier provides themselves and their leader a SMART goal, right? So something that's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, the ability to properly and efficiently train and the ability to properly program for that goal is going to be suboptimal, which means the results are going to be suboptimal. Okay. And what you see on the top here is the movement analysis of the sport. So in this picture, they are performing an evacuation of a casualty, right? So if you have a weight in one hand, as you see these soldiers holding this litter and they're moving forward in the sagittal plane, what exercise does that correlate to?
And can you repeat that, Sunrise?
Absolutely. So if you look at the picture, these soldiers are evacuating casualty. They're moving in the sagittal plane with a litter. They have weight in one hand, and that hand is in a neutral position, meaning the palm is facing the body. If you needed to do an exercise in the gym that was exactly like this in order to train for it, what exercise would that be?
I would say X bar deadlift or performance carry.
So you have some components of it. So a farmer's carry means you have weight in both hands. If you have weight in one hand, it's called a suitcase carry.
Right.
And that may seem trivial, at first, right? The nuances between that may seem trivial for most individuals that don't practice or study a lot of the physiological components involved. But I'm sure you've experienced this if you've ever tried to catch a flight and you had a heavy bag, right, with you, and you were almost late to the flight, right? You had a close connection. It is much, much, much more difficult for the most part to carry weight in one hand than it is in two. Why do you think that is? Good, because you have an go ahead, sir. What?
Because you also got to stabilize the other side that doesn't have weight. Well,
Perfect. So both you and Sergeant Boyer are correct because you have an asymmetrical load, right? You have weight on one side, which means in order for you to keep moving just sagittally, so you want to move straight forward because that's the goal, your body's trying to now counter rotation. You're trying to keep your shoulders equally level. You're trying to, it increases the engagement of your rectus abdominis, your internal, external obliques, and even your hip flexors to try to modify how you are moving forward with weight on one side. So it makes it significantly more difficult. In the task where you see on the picture, it makes it even more challenging because you have variables such as uneven terrain, which is the primary environment that we work with in our occupation. We don't really have flat surfaces that we work on. And then you have the coordination of working with other people, right? So if they're not changing their support, right? So stepping as you step, if they're not all equally supporting the amount of weight that's going to be moved, that's going to be a big piece. So if they're leaning away, they're rotating a lot, that's going to increase your demand to accommodate for the forces you have to produce because of what they're doing, right? They're making that asymmetrical balance even more difficult. And of course, this is harder whether you're carrying the head of the soldier, which is always going to be heavier, or the legs, right? So it's very important that we look at these when we're going to be training in the gym. So for what Sergeant Watts brought up in the beginning, a deadlift, if this litter was on the ground, you're gonna have to pick it up. So if training the deadlift or training a lunge would be the very first movement pattern you would need if one of your METs or critical task you had to perform was evacuating a casualty, right? Performing a lunge or deadlift to get that weight from the ground to waist level. And then in order to move forward with that would be the suitcase carry. So does that correlation make sense? So that's where we get into the SAID principle, right? So specific adaptations to impose demands. You want to get better at picking things up? You better train picking things up. You want to get better at moving with weight forward? You have to be able to practice moving with that weight forward. Your body is extremely specific with regards to adaptations, right? So training a farmer carry will make you better at a suitcase carry, but not as specific as training a suitcase carry will. Right? It's not exactly a one-to-one correlation. Questions so far? So when you do your needs analysis, you want to be able to look at, again, if I needed to get over an obstacle, that's my primary purpose, is I need to be able to get over an obstacle, whether that's in and out of a vehicle or over a window, over a wall. What do you think when we come back to this slide here? If I need to get over a wall, which one of these four primary variables would be a primary focus for that training?
Strength,
Why would you say strength?
be able to perform the body.
Okay, so you're not wrong, but let's refine the reasoning why. And this, I really want to get you to start thinking about exercises in this manner as a trainer. I need to get over a wall, right? What two variables am I looking at? So power, both strength and power are accurate, right? You're both correct. One is a little bit more specific than the other. How did you choose power, Sergeant Watts?
because like getting over a wall, that's an explosive movement. So the more power you could generate, the easier it'd be for you to get over that wall.
Good, good. So you're both right. You can get over a wall quickly, and usually it saves energy, even though you're producing more force. But you can get over a wall or an obstacle slowly as well. That would require more strength. But the critical component I want you to think about for this, if you're performing a needs analysis so you can actually do your program, is this. How many times realistically would you need to be able to get over a wall when it comes to the realistic effort? Like if you were in an operational environment, you need to get over a fence. How many times are you going to have to do that per set?
How many times we need to be able to jump the fence?
Yeah, per set. If you had like a work to rest period. Not a trick question. Maybe overthinking it. Once, exactly. When you go, even if you had several walls to go over, it's not, you're not performing repetitions of getting over a wall, right? You get over the wall, you have to get to the next wall and get over another wall, right? Same thing with windows, etc. There's singular effort. So because it's singular effort, you automatically know it's not going to be endurance or hypertrophy, right? Because those involve a lot more volume. The entire purpose for endurance was being able to do something for a lot of volume, right? So a lot of repetitions. So because it's singular effort, you want to either be able to get over that obstacle quickly, which would be power, or you need to be able to get over that obstacle with maybe an external load, such as you have a weapon, an ACH, right, a kit, or whatever it is, and that would revolve around strength. And this is how I need you and how we need our soldiers to start looking at these movement patterns. If I need to be able to pick up a water heater, right? Say for laundry and bath as an example, I need to be able to pick up a water heater. It weighs about 460 pounds. It's a 6-man lift. The initial aspect of picking that up, how many efforts are involved? How many times you need to pick it up before you move it? Once, right? So that means it's going to require strength or power when you train your soldiers. Now, once it's in hand and you need to be able to move it forward, that moving forward may be at 20-meter intervals, 40-meter intervals, 60-meter intervals, etc. Now, when moving forward, what type of training are we looking at? Endurance, good, right? Because now we're talking about duration. We're talking about something carrying over for a longer period of time. So if I needed to just break down picking up a water heater and moving it, I'm looking at already 2 completely different training variables and training days. I'm gonna have a day where I'm focusing on picking up a heavy load, matching the same type of lift, right? So there's some type of neutral grip, so a trap bar deadlift or some type of kettlebell deadlift or lunge. And then when I'm training on moving it forward, I'm going to train doing a suitcase carry at an intensity that's going to challenge my rotation, which will challenge my core, and then to challenge my grip endurance, so my ability to hold that water heater for a long period of time. Now, typically the grips that we have for military equipment, unless it's a handle, are a much thicker diameter than you will have with a barbell, kettlebell, or dumbbell, which means it has a more significant demand on our forearm in order to be able to close our phalanges, to be able to close our fingers around that object. So it challenges your grip endurance. So when you are looking at something as simple as that for an occupational task, you already have all of these variables we can see to be able to put together that program, which is why it's important to be able to perform the needs analysis. Questions? So here's the other good thing. Training for strength and training to be tactical, training for endurance, those can be somewhat challenging in the beginning, somewhat complex. Training for hypertrophy, which is typically the average person's goal, right? Most people want to look better, is one of the easiest things to train. Now, you should still follow the principles earlier, right? Specificity, overload, and progression. But specificity with hypertrophy is rather nuanced, right? We can't target fat loss. So you can't do abdominal exercises to get rid of belly fat. You can't do chest exercises to get rid of fat in your chest. It doesn't work like that. But you can teach your body how to refine the musculature in a specific area by introducing enough volume in a certain area. All right, so your caloric intake and the overall energy balance will tell your body whether it should hold on to adipose tissue and fill fat cells, or to focus on muscle protein synthesis, which is your lean tissue. And then your exercise will tell your body exactly where to undergo that hypertrophic change, whether it's in your triceps, biceps, quadriceps, hamstrings, etc. Right? So you could do practically any exercise you need in hypertrophy as long as you're overloading, progressing, and getting your volume goals. You don't need to be as specific for the movement pattern as you would be for endurance, strength, and power, especially for the tactical setting. So if your soldiers are trying to lose weight, right? Again, even if we want to stay within that term, if they want to gain muscle, it's much easier to program for. From that, we get into our exercise selection, right? Which we've already kind of covered in the verbally. So when after you perform your goal, after you perform your needs analysis, you know your goal, you know what you need to work on, then you're actually choosing your exercises as we just did, right? So picking up that litter, we chose deadlift and lunge. Moving forward, we talked about a suitcase carrier. So the specificity, what does that individual's job consist of? If you have detainee operations as an example, what are some movement operation or movements you would need to do for detainee ops? Some physical movements.
If the inmate or detainee is not compliant, you may have to lift him off the floor, or maybe fight him a little bit.
Yes.
Depends.
So you have a non-compliant detainee. You need to be able to, first gain dominance of the situation, which may mean you need to be able to lift them up, right? To be able to eliminate their capability of having any type of stable or balanced force on the ground, which means they can't push off the ground to be able to provide force against you. You may need to be able to restrain them, right, against a wall or against the floor. And a lot of that is done holding that person for, hopefully not a long time, right? We never want something like that to last long, but it can. So as you're pushing someone for a long period of time, what type of muscular contraction is that? You're producing force, but a movement isn't happening.
Concentric?
So that's one of the three. What would be the other two contractions? You have concentric contraction, what else?
Oh, God. Eccentric?
Good, one more. So you have concentric contractions, eccentric contractions, and?
Help me out, guys.
What do you think, Sergeant Boyer? Concentric contractions, eccentric contractions, and? All right, your last one is isometric. So a concentric contraction means, say you're doing a bicep curl, right? Concentric contraction is defined as the shortening of a angle at a joint. So if I'm bringing my forearm closer to my humerus, I'm going through elbow flexion and I'm shortening my muscle. I misspoke. A concentric contraction is when you shorten a muscle. Flexion is when you're decreasing the angle at a joint. So if I'm flexing my elbow joint, I'm concentrically contracting my bicep. Right? I'm shortening my bicep, which means what's happening with my tricep? It's lengthening, which is an eccentric contraction. Now, if I'm producing force, so I'm pushing one hand against the other, and I'm going through a concentric contraction in one bicep, or excuse me, I'm producing force in one bicep in order to try and curl, but I'm not actually moving that arm, right? So I'm producing force without movement. That's considered an isometric contraction. See that distinction? So that is more relevant to an individual, say your MPs that do detainee operations. If you know they're going to be able to have to hold someone in a specific position, but constantly produce force, whether that is pulling them in, right? So arms around, maybe you're holding their arm in a specific position, you're trying to hold them to you. That's an isometric pull with regards to your arms, at least in a certain position. If you need to press them up against a wall or push them against the floor and you're constantly pressing, that is still in isometric contraction, right? So that type of contraction would be hyper-specific to an MP that would have to be able to perform detainee operations, which means when you come to your exercise selection, you should still be choosing movements that go through concentric and eccentric contractions, but you should also be incorporating isometric contractions to teach the body how to adapt to the long-term production of force at that angle. Does that make sense? Well, this is where, and it's definitely possible, right? You're not always gonna be the strongest person in the room. But this is why we want to be able to train strength. This is a good question. So when you have individuals, say we'll stick on the same example, detainee operations for military police, you want to be able to have days where you're focusing on the strength of those movements, right? So producing horizontal force, like in a bench press, or being able to do a bent over row, a pin lay row, something powerful to pull something to you, maybe an overhead press, right? Get something away from you at a different angle. Same thing with your legs. Anyone that's got any type of close quarter combat type of training understands that it always comes down to being on the ground. It usually gets down to the ground in the first 5 to 10 seconds. It's almost all groundwork. And when you're on the ground, your legs have a huge component to it. So being able to produce force through knee extension is huge. Same thing with hip adduction, right? So being able to squeeze your legs together if you have your legs around someone. So that comes to your groin muscles. Being able to produce strength in those components is vital for that MOS. And then being able to supplement those exercises with accessory exercises that focus on isometric would also help that individual, right? So you get them stronger so they can produce more force, and then you train isometric so they have the long-term endurance of that contraction. That way they need it when they have it when they need it. Okay. Good. Now, you see on the screen, right, the specificity for the dependency of the job. So infantry have more of an endurance-based component, which we don't have any combat arms within our particular organization, right? But we do supplement combat arms in certain ways, right? Especially in our battalion, because we're at least with the 393rd Battalion, because we're a CSSB. But we have movement under load, something we all need to do to one component or another, whether that's patrolling like a foot march, or just getting from point A to point B with excess weight on us, body armor, etc. Being able to lift heavy objects, we have a lot of transportation, engineers, mechanics that need to be able to move chains, binders. They need to be able to move engine blocks, tires. A lot of this equipment just from point A to point B, usually singular effort or maybe a few efforts at high intensity with some type of rest period, which is what type of training? Less volume, higher intensity. So you just think lift heavy object, what type of training do you think? Strength, good. So mechanic or engineer training strength and power are typically better for them. Or more specific to them, I should say, than certain forms of endurance. And then if they need to be able to stand or sit all day, so if we look at other aspects of MP, right, so traffic operations, you have, like gate operations, where you have someone that's going to be a truck driver, someone that is, again, human resources, signal, where they'll be sitting all day, being able to train hypertrophy, training their overall posture and ability to maintain that overall capacity of their composition when they are rather immobile most of the day. That would be more specific to those MOSs. Good. And as we're trying to choose these exercises, of course, we want to look at how much time does a soldier have to exercise. Strength training typically takes a lot longer of a training period than endurance training will, because of the rest times, the amount of effort that's put in, what equipment that person has available. If that person doesn't have access to a general training facility, a typical training facility, then training strength and power is going to be extremely difficult, right? So in that case, we may need to get what we can by training hypertrophy or training endurance. So whatever equipment they have available is what we're going to be able to program for, especially for TPU that don't have either the money or the access to some of these training facilities. And the amount of experience they have. If they've never lifted weights before, our exercises shouldn't be that complex, right? Not everyone needs to squat. Not everyone needs to bench press. If you're not training to be a power lifter and compete, those aren't always critical movements, but they're still really good movements overall to be able to teach the body overall physical literacy and to be able to produce force for general health and force and in general bone development. But we really need to look at the specificity when it comes to exercise selection. Any questions so far? And welcome, Sergeant Rodriguez and Sergeant Lopez. All right, so then training frequency, right? How often you should be training in the week. Again, this comes back to training age. If you have someone that doesn't or hasn't trained often, then they don't really need to train more than maybe 2 to 3 times a week. And often that's quite freeing, right? If you have someone that are, are TPU soldiers that have, children and they have one or more jobs for the civilian capacity, maybe they're working for the post office, maybe they're working night shift or they're working in medical, so they have these swing shifts. It's not necessarily a static work schedule. Then trying to train 5 days a week is, it's too big of an ask. It is. It's very hard. And then sometimes with them not knowing that and they try and train 5 days a week and they can't keep up with it, then that kills their auto-regulation. Right? They think that this isn't for me. I can't do it. I don't have time. Because it's usually one extreme or the other, unfortunately. They either think that they need to give it their all, or don't give it at all. Don't give anything. Instead of trying to meet somewhere in between, somewhere halfway. So training 2 to 3 days a week is perfectly fine. We just need to look at how, again, can we optimize those 2 to 3 days that we can put in. Recovery is another big piece of this. One of the most critical pieces for how often you should train is how quickly you can recover. If you're training in true strength, right, so sub 6 repetitions in 3 rep maxes, 5 rep maxes, you more than likely don't want to train at that intensity more than twice a week. And you may want about 72 hours in between those training programs. If you're trying to train strength and you're trying to get into the gym to hit strength 5 days a week, you're going to be pushing your limit quite a bit because your body's not going to be able to recover as quick. And then that means you're not going to be able to put as much effort and you may be increasing your risk of injury. So then why are you doing it, right? So rest periods and your recovery is very important to be able to look at. Right? As you see on the screen, recovery is going to govern your overall optimal adaptation. And that's also come into active rest versus passive rest, or active recovery versus passive recovery. Does anyone want to hazard a guess what's the difference between an active and passive recovery day? Yep. Would be a passive recovery day.
Say I am running.
Mm-hmm.
I want to run the same amount of miles I used to train, but less. Like, let's say I'm training for a 5K. Well, that day I just run 1 mile.
Good. So if you couldn't hear him, for teams, he was saying that a active recovery for him would be training with less volume, right? So if he was going to train for 5K, then that day he may only train for 1 mile, and that's exactly. So it's still keeping movement. So an active recovery day means that you're training the same patterns of your normal workday, the same exact patterns as your normal workday. So if you're going to squat, it's a squat. If you're going to run, it's a run. But you lower the intensity and you lower the volume. You make it a day where you're focusing on the biomechanical patterns, but not to a degree where you're overtaxing the body. You're not overloading the body so that you are still able to recover and improve. Conversely, a passive recovery day are your rest days. That's where you do nothing. Those are so important for your overall body. Rest days are where you allow your body to get maximal recovery. Now, of course, you don't want to treat every day as a rest day, like some of our soldiers do, but you also don't want to be training 2 days, 3 days, and also 5 to 6 days a week, right? The best program, and you've heard me say this before, and you'll hear me say this over and over again, the absolute best program you can ever do is the one where you are training the least amount of frequency possible, so the least amount of time per week possible, but you're still making adaptations, right? Because you're introducing the least amount of damage, but you're still teaching your body, you're giving your body the information of how to improve. That is the best program you can have. More is not always better. All right. And then, of course, what intensity you're training at will govern the frequency. As aforementioned, if you're training strength and power, your frequency is going to be much less. If you're training hypertrophy, you can train hypertrophy twice a day, 5 days a week. because it's not really a performance-based thing. In this case, you're just working on time under tension and volume, right? You're going for that overall pump. So you're just, working these movement patterns, getting the pump in the area, so you can train that often. And then endurance, because the intensity is so low, you can train that often as well. Questions from either teams or individuals in the room? Good. Exercise order. So looking at just a singular day, if you're going to program for one day, your exercise order should look as follows. After your warm-up, and we've covered warm-ups in a prior block of instruction, right? You have your general, dynamic, and specific warm-ups. After you perform your warm-up period and you get to your main activity should be some type of structural or core exercise. And there's 9 of those with some variation. Your 9 core lifts are as follows. You have your squat, bench press, deadlift, overhead press, right, which is a strict press, and bent over row. Those are your strength-based core lifts, the 5 of them. And then you have your 4 power lifts, which are clean, snatch, jerk, and push press, which is the overhead press with the momentum component because you're actually using your legs. All of those are compound movements because they are multi-joint movements. All of them load your axial skeleton, which is your skull and your vertebral column, your spine. And for every single one of these, you could safely perform a 1 rep max. Those make up and should make up the base part of every single one of your resistance days for whatever program you have. Generally, the main activity, if you're going to get into the gym at all, even whether you're working endurance, hypertrophy, strength, etc., your main activity should be based around one of those 9 lifts. So those would be your structural lifts. The power exercises, again, go into those core and structural, and everything else, absolutely everything else, is an accessory exercise. Anything you do besides those 9 should be assistance or accessory exercises to those core exercises, to that main lift. And generally those assistance exercises only really need to be maybe 1 to 3 exercises. Sometimes people go into the gym and they do way too much, right? They're doing maybe 12 to 15 different exercises, and you're kind of over inundating rather your body with information. And again, that also doesn't allow your body to optimally improve.
Okay.
Go ahead, John Boy.
When I go to the gym,
Mhm.
I listen to people that minimum, for example, your goal is to do some chest.
Okay.
Only you got chest. You need to perform minimum 8 exercises.
Okay. Okay, so for those of you who couldn't hear him, he said that for things that he's heard, if you're going to go to the gym and train chest, to do about a minimum of 8 exercises. So just by the definition of, or by the statement of training chest, what type of training program do you think we're looking at? Strength, hypertrophy, power, or endurance?
It could be hypertrophy and strength at the same time. So
it would be primarily hypertrophy. And the reason I say that is if you're trying to get stronger, or you're trying to get train for endurance, you're trying to train for power, if you're having a performance-based goal, you should never, ever, ever focus on muscle for a performance-based goal. And those we should be focusing on the movement, right? So your pectoralis major has 2 primary heads, right? Your sternal head and your clavicular head. And they do horizontal adduction and then shoulder flexion respectively. So your sternal head, because your pectoralis major is a fan-shaped muscle, brings your arm closer to your body, typically through horizontal adduction, which is something like a fly. And then if you go through shoulder flexion, that's what your pectoralis major helps assist in, similar with your anterior delt and your bicep, in order to shorten your clavicular head of your pectoralis major. It helps move that shoulder joint in those mechanics, which we see in a fly, in a shoulder raise, a front raise, in a bench press, overhead press, etc. But those movements won't necessarily make your chest bigger, and they won't, by focusing on making your chest bigger, won't necessarily make you stronger or improve your endurance, which is where that intensity chart came in earlier. And it's in where your body is very specific on overall adaptations. So if you have a traditional bodybuilder split where like Monday's International Chest Day, you're focusing on hypertrophy. And when you're focusing on hypertrophy, you don't have a performance-based goal. You may never get stronger working in hypertrophy. You may never improve your overall endurance working in hypertrophy. But if you're focused specifically on it and your nutrition's on point, you will definitely look better, right? So that's where that comes in. And as I said earlier, hypertrophy has a different special kind of aspect to it. Because you're not training performance, your whole goal is volume. Your whole goal is being able to hit enough volume that you can recover from it and do it again. So hitting 8 exercises for a chest, if that's all you're going to hit in that day, is fine, right? Because you're doing enough volume to be able to get the overall pump, so you get, which is scientifically considered your sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, right? Getting a lot of blood to the area, increasing the fluid that's within those tissues. And then you're doing that often enough and fueling your body often enough to hopefully increase the cross-sectional area of your chest to have those hypertrophic adaptations. But that won't necessarily make you stronger, faster, or being able to do more repetitions.
If I reduce the amount of exercise, but at the same time, I impact the whole area. For example, bench press, but in the 3 positions at a high intensity, that would make the same effect or not?
It may or may not make the same effect because now we're talking about several components, right? Again, it always comes back to the goal. If your goal is hypertrophy, you just need to activate that muscle group to a high amount of volume that you can recover from and do it again and do it frequently. That's all you need to do for hypertrophy, as well as eat right. So it's the easiest one to program for. But again, that won't increase your endurance and it will not increase your strength. Having more muscle and having bigger muscles doesn't necessarily make you stronger. If you wanted to increase your strength, we need to look at the movement you want to get stronger at. Right? So if you wanted to increase your strength in a bench press, you would need to work at what rep range? Strength. And this is for everyone. You want to increase strength in bench press, what rep range would you work at?
No more than 6 reps.
Good. So no more than 6 repetitions, meaning the weight you put on the bar, you shouldn't be able to move that weight 7, 8, 9 times. Now, because that intensity has increased, now the rest period is going to increase and your recovery period is going to increase. So now you absolutely don't want to be doing 8 exercises. You really want to do your warm up, maybe hit 3 to a maximal of possibly 5 sets on bench press, maybe do 1 to 3 accessory exercises that focus on your weaknesses in bench press, which could be the exact opposite of the movement, right? It could be a horizontal pull, like an inverted row or some type of seated row, cable row, in order to pull the weight to you and focus on that push-pull, anterior-posterior aspect. It could be focusing on the stability of your shoulder joint for internal or external rotation, something along those lines. And that's it. You would call that a session. You may not even feel tired at the end of the session, but if you're doing that consistently enough and overloading consistently enough, you will get stronger. Right, so that's going to be the key difference between training for strength and training for hypertrophy. Do you see the difference on those? Good. Any other questions so far? All right, so for your exercise order and exercise selection, you, again, always want to focus everything on your goal. If you have a soldier that can work out only twice a week or 3 times a week, the general best practice is for those few days to have maybe 48 to 72 hours in between, and for those to be total body sessions, right? As many compound movements as they can get in, as high intensity as they can maintain in total body sessions. If you do total body, you should always focus with lower body first and then upper body, Right, that's going to help your body recover more, and it's been shown through various research that if you focus on lower body movements before upper body movements, you have a higher production of testosterone during stage 4 of sleep, which is going to help you recover faster, right? And everything's about the recoverability aspect. So if you're going to be doing total body, legs should come first, and you generally want to match the intensity of the session overall. So if you're training at around 10 rep max, then you want to keep all of your main activities around 10 rep max. You don't want to have a 5 rep max squat and a 12 rep max bench press and a 30 rep on deadlift all in the same session, because you'll be giving your body different information. Right? If you really want to be specifically better at one thing. If you have the time to break that up into several sessions per week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week, etc., that's when you can start being a lot more specific, right? That's when we can say, well, now maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday during my odd weeks are lower body, and Tuesday and Thursday are upper body. And then on my even weeks, I'll flip-flop that, and Monday, Wednesday, and Friday could be upper body, and then Tuesday and Thursday can be lower body. That way your overall volume that you're working at, you're trying to equate it and make it equal, if you don't have one specific focus. Right? If your focus and your goal is primarily upper body, then maybe 3 times a week it should be upper body, right? But everything should come back to your end state. Questions? All right. Training load. This comes back to the chart that we started this whole lesson plan with. And again, it looks like a lot of math on here, but I'll try and explain it to make it easier. If you're going to have a goal, you need to be able to perform what before you program? I want to increase my deadlift to 450 pounds, right? If I'm going to be deadlifting, I need to know what?
Where you're at?
Where I'm at, which is a what? An assessment. No program should begin without an assessment, because you cannot perform overload, and therefore you can't perform progressive overload if you don't know where you are. If you're shooting in the dark, you're not giving your body the information that you want. Right? So it's not about feeling tired or feeling sore. It's not about the session being difficult. It's about giving your body the specific information it needs. So for the example you see on here, doing a 1 rep max assessment is generally ill-advised. If I don't have someone that's going to be a power lifter or a weightlifter and actually compete in 1 rep max, I will tell you right now, I will never have an athlete or a client perform an actual 1 rep max if they don't have to compete in it. That's my personal philosophy, just because you don't get anything out of doing a 1 rep max outside of the psychological aspect of understanding what it feels like to produce force and to be able to go through that grit. And there's a lot of value in that. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of value in that. But the risk versus reward is too high, in my opinion, for 1 rep max. So therefore, if I have a soldier, or I have a client that is not competing in those sports, I'm generally going to assess them around a 6 rep max, 8 rep max, or a 10 rep max. All right, so if for what you see on the top of the PowerPoint, it is a 10 rep max approximation and an 8 rep max approximation. So 10 rep max to our earlier chart equates to about 70%, 75% of your 1 rep max, and 8 rep max equates to approximately 80% of 1 rep max. So if you had someone go into the gym, they warmed up, and they kept doing sets of deadlift until they got to a weight that they could do 8 of with 0 RIR, right? 0 reps in reserve. They couldn't have done a 9th if their life depended on it. And that was 275 pounds. You would find their 8 rep max, or you'd have 8 rep max right there. You'd find their 1 rep max by dividing 275 by 0.8, which is 80%. And that would give you an approximation of 345 pounds as a 1 rep max. Once you have that number, you can use it to design the rest of your program. You can use it so if you wanted to train endurance at 15 rep max, which was about the 65% intensity from the chart from FM7-22, then you would just multiply that 345 by 65% to see what your 15 rep max is. That allows you to overload rather than just shooting in the dark and throwing on random weight. Right? So the 345 pound example for deadlift, If they wanted to go in and start week 1 at a 10 rep max for hypertrophy, then their working weight would be somewhere around 260 pounds, plus or minus, right? Depending on their actual capacity at working at that volume. Okay. Now you would take that, and depending on whether you want to work strength or hypertrophy, which I put both examples up here on the screen, you can see how different load volumes can work. So your load volume or overall volumes can work. So you have load volume and rep volume. Load volume is when you take the amount of weight you moved and the amount of repetitions that you did. All right, so if we took that 260 pounds and they were working at 10 reps, every set of that exercise, in this case deadlift, they would be moving approximately 2,600 pounds. Okay. If they did 3 sets of that, every session for deadlift, they'd move about 7,800 pounds. Being able to track how the overall poundage of what they're moving per week and how their recovery is working per week will allow them to see what their overall work capacity is. This is essential to understand how much rest you truly need in order to recover. If they were able to get to the gym and they couldn't hit that same amount of volume, or they were nowhere near the volume they needed, then maybe they need more recovery time. Or maybe they need to work with more repetitions in reserve, because we don't always need to train to failure. The most optimal training intensity we've seen in research is hitting a 1 to 2 rep in reserve every set. Right. So if in this case, if we saw that 260 pounds is our approximate 10 rep max, we're truly going to hit 10 reps, maybe we want to do our 10 reps at 250 pounds. That way we leave a little bit in reserve and we're not actually hitting our max. Any questions on that so far? But
it could be a question and maybe turn into a suggestion, but do you have like a table in Excel where soldiers or people, whatever, they can simply input their data and it's gonna automatically calculate for them? Because I know people, they see numbers and they're like, I don't want to do all this.
I agree. And yes, I do. In fact, I loaded it as a training aid into the Teams chat already, and we'll be pulling that up actually shortly to discuss it. So the difference between load volume and rep volume is load volume, you're just looking at total reps, but you can equate this for a different training value. So the 2 examples you see here is if that person's 260 pounds is their 10 rep max and they did 10 sets of 3, right? So if you're only doing 3 repetitions, that means for RAR, if that was your true 10 rep max, you have 7 repetitions in reserve. Does everyone see how I got that?
I don't have my glasses, so I can't even.
All right, so if you can do 260 pounds 10 times, but you only did it 3 times, you have 7 reps in reserve. Okay. If you trained like that and you did 10 sets of 3, your whole focus should be moving as quick as possible. This is considered acceleration training and is a huge component of training toward strength. You're not training the intensity of strength, but you're training the acceleration component of force, because force is mass and acceleration. So that's a critical piece to be able to improve the dynamic forces for strength production. Conversely, if you did 3 sets of 10, which is the traditional type of resistance training, you would move the same amount of poundage, but because you're moving 10 repetitions, the volume per set has changed. You're increasing the overall time under tension, and you're giving your body the adaptation that hypertrophy is important. So instead of focusing on force acceleration, what your body's actually going to get better at is improving the cross-sectional area or your aesthetics. So even though the intensity is the same and the total volume is the same, changing the effort per set and the amount of rest in between will completely change how your body adapts to that information. Any questions on that? All right, so rest periods, this is just going to correlate to that chart we showed earlier. Power and strength, you should have a lot of rest. And strength training is often seen as the most boring form of training because of this. But if you did true strength training, you should be having a very high effort, very short duration, and a very, very, very long rest period. So if you're doing, say, sets of 3, you want to be able to rest about 4 to 5 minutes of doing nothing in between your sets. That way your actual effort can be maximal. And then, of course, you want to recover in between as well. Without doing that, you will never give your body the ability to properly recover to actually get stronger. So a lot of people don't rest enough in order to get stronger. Same thing with hypertrophy. Most forms of hypertrophy actually require 1 to 3 minutes of rest in between in order to optimize the amount of effort you can produce for overall rest. So if you're just going back to back, you're doing as much as you can, as often as you can with a little rest in between, you are not giving your body optimal information for power, strength, or hypertrophy. On the opposite side of the coin, if you have limited rest, what you are telling your body to get better at is endurance, right? How often you can buffer lactic acid, not necessarily lactic acid, but how often you can buffer pH and how often you can do multiple contractions in order to improve overall volume. This chart is going to show you RIR to RPE, right? So how hard the effort is to how many reps you should have in reserve. So as aforementioned, your general training RIR should be 1 to 2, meaning what is your general training RPE? If you had 1 rep in reserve, what RPE are you more than likely at?
No effort at all. Like sitting, lying down, stretching.
If you had 1 repetition in reserve, if you were in a bench, when you had 1 left, go ahead.
RPE 9.
RPE 9, the very, very hard, right? So if you have on your left side chart RPE 9, you see in the right side of your chart you'll have an RIR of 1. Right? We typically want to stay between an 8 and a 9. It doesn't mean you're breathing hard. It doesn't mean your heart rate's up. It doesn't mean you're sweating. It's something completely different. That's not the definition of effort that we're talking about. We're talking about the amount of intensity you're putting in. If you can move that weight 15 times, but you only move it 10 times, you have about 5 repetitions in reserve, which means it's going to be an RP between overall 5 and 6, which is not a good overload in order for you to get better, depending on what you're training at. Right. This chart is just going to summarize everything we talked about before. So you start with your warm-up, you get to anything you really want to get better at, your compound movements for your skills, and then you do your accessory-based movements before you cool down. So let's see what that looks like in practice. If an individual wanted to improve their deadlift, and then they assessed their deadlift to be 370 pounds as 1 rep max, you see on the top left, as well as their bent over row, right, to be 250 pounds. For a muscular endurance day, they would do some type of general warm-up to focus on heart rate, a dynamic warm-up in order to focus on mobilization, and then they would get into their actual specific warm-up, which you see in the center, right? So 3 sets, 1 at 40% for 7 reps, 1 at 50% for 7 reps, and 1 at 55% for 5 reps. Then they get to their main lift. 5 sets of 13 at 240 pounds for deadlift or 165 pounds for bent over row, right? You're getting those percentages from that 1 rep max you see at the top left. You see the short rest period of 45 seconds. And then you get into your accessory lifts for those movement patterns, right? A kettlebell push press, a leg tuck, an inverted row, and a suitcase carry to focus on overall capacity for them to be able to work those same movement patterns. We need to get each of our soldiers and ourselves, of course, to a point where they can look at these type of charts and understand all of these variables, as well as to be able to program for themselves for all of these variables. I'm going to give you a moment to look at this. And let me know if you have any questions as you look it over. All right, so again, this is a singular day for all the variables we just talked about. You have your assessment, the movement patterns. This is overall volume, right? Sets and reps. Intensity is the weight they're going to be moving at. And we should always prescribe an intensity by percentage if it's a core lift. And in order to find that percentage, of course, is why we need an assessment. If you tell your soldier, hey, I want you to go deadlift 225 pounds, but you have no idea what 225 pounds means to them, then you can't give them a training volume. You can't say, I want you to do 3 sets of 8 at 185 pounds if they can't move that 8 times, or if moving that weight for them is so light they could do it 20 times, then that information is arbitrary for them. It's irrelevant. So you need to know what's specific to them. So assessments are of critical importance. Your rest period is going to be directly correlated to the overall goal, right? In this case, muscular endurance. And then, of course, you want to remain in an optimal training RPE. So if you see 8, how many repetitions in reserve should that person have from earlier?
Two reps in reserve.
2 reps in reserve. So in other words, what this would mean, if you once you taught your athlete what this how to read this and how to design this for themselves, they would warm up with deadlift, right? They do one set of 7 reps at 40% of their 1 rep max. Then they would do another set, 7 reps at 50% of their 1 rep max, and so on and so forth, right? Last warm up set of 5 reps at 55% of the warm rep max. Then their first actual main lift, their first set of 5, because we're gonna be doing 5 sets of this, they would do 1 of 13 at 65%. Now, 65% from the chart that we showed earlier is about how many repetitions? Think about it this way. 8 repetitions means how many reps in reserve? 2. So that means they should be able to do how many reps if they have 2 repetitions in reserve? The other way. 15. So they should be able to do 15 repetitions of 240 pounds. You're only having them do 13 in order to keep 2 repetitions in reserve, because you don't need to train to failure, especially in endurance. Then they would rest 45 seconds, not doing anything. After those 45 seconds, they'll do their second set of 13 at 240. And the goal is that they can do all 5 sets at the same weight for the same amount of repetitions without having to lower those repetitions. If they get into set 4 or 5 and they can't hit 13, that means that their endurance is lacking to be able to maintain that intensity for that total volume, which means the next time they do this session, they should be training at maybe 5 pounds less, 10 pounds less, right? More repetitions in reserve until they can get full 5 sets of 13. Once they can get 5 sets of 13 and they feel that they can get it consistently, that's when they're actually going to start increasing the weight and maintaining that progression so they can improve their overall muscular endurance. Do you see what I mean? Their next main lift would be bench over row. So after all 5 sets of deadlift, they would do 5 sets of 13 with bent over row, in this case at 165 pounds, which is still for them 2 repetitions in reserve. Now, when you get to your accessory lifts, like a kettlebell push press, your accessory lifts don't have a 1 rep max because they're not core lifts. So in this case, you can absolutely assign a specific weight value. In this case, I put 35 pounds. Of course, you want to be able to assign a weight that they can do for a certain amount of volume, or a weight, well, obviously a weight they can do, but the weight should generally correlate to what they need to get better at, right? So a kettlebell push press is really good to be able to get weight overhead. Practicing for something like the standing power throw, something like getting a soldier over a wall, something like that. In this case, because you may not know how many repetitions they can do, you can give them a weight, but then you give them a duration to work toward. So for one soldier, if they're doing 4 sets of 37 seconds, they may get 28 repetitions in. And another soldier may get 24 repetitions in. But for both of them, if they're working as hard as they can for that 37 seconds, they're getting the same respective amount of work in. You'd have a very short rest period, in this case 23 seconds, to focus on the endurance, and then they would be able to do that again for 4 sets. Because you just did a vertical push, a good way to antagonize this for recovery is to do a vertical pull, right? So then they can get to leg tuck. And this is doing a 4-minute EMOM, right? EMOM stands for every minute on the minute. So every minute on the minute, they would do 8 repetitions. So the quicker they would do that, the more rest they would get. Of course, if they can't do 8 repetitions, this chart would be irrelevant for them, right? So you need to program toward their capabilities, which is where assessments come in. A good way to do local muscular endurance, like a leg tuck or say like the hand release push-up, is you would assess them at 1 minute, or really just irrelevant of time. How many can they do in one effort, right? So you have them warm up. You see how many push-ups could they do if they just maximally until they can't do anymore. Let's say that came out to 50 push-ups, right? You asked them to do as many push-ups as they can, hand release push-ups, and they did 50. A good way to program for that is you would come to your actual day, you double the volume. So if you double 50, we get what? 100. So then you would break that 100 repetitions, the double volume, into the number of sets they're going to perform. So if you wanted them to do 5 sets, you would divide that 100 by 5 and you would get 20. So if this was a hand release push-up instead, then you would do 5-minute EMOM at 20 reps every minute on the minute. So they would do 20 as quick as they could, rest. As soon as the timer goes off again, next minute they do another 20, because they can absolutely do 20, right? That's sub max effort for them since they were able to do 50. But in the end of it, they'd be doubling the overall volume that they can within that time frame. And you'd focus on increasing by maybe about 1 to 2 repetitions every week within that EMOM until they get to a point where they can't hit the goal. Once they can't hit the goal, then they're plateaued. They want to stay there for a while until it becomes easier, then they increase again. Everyone see how I did that? Any questions on this?
How do you calculate the rest time?
Good question. So the rest is going to correlate to the training variable. If you're training strength, what are your rest periods?
3 to 5 minutes.
3 to 5 minutes. Hypertrophy will be 1 to 3. Endurance is going to be 30 to 45 seconds. Ideally, you want the minimal rest possible to have the same effort. So regardless of whether you're working in hypertrophy, endurance, or strength, if you notice that you're trying to train hypertrophy, an example, at 10 rep max with 2 repetitions reserved, if you had your timer specifically at 60 seconds and by set 3 you can't hit 10, that means 60 seconds isn't enough for you to recover. Maybe you need to try 70 seconds the next time. Once you find what your minimal is, you want to stay there and potentially try and decrease your rest period over time. But it's very important to notice your effort. If you get to your later sets, set 3, set 4, set 5, and you cannot hit the same amount of reps, you are not resting long enough, or you're not recovering for your actual recovery days long enough. You may not be fueling your body long enough, but you want every set to hit the same amount of reps. A common failure that people do, especially with endurance, is they want to train push-ups. They're going to do 3 sets. In the first set, they end up doing 40. In the second set, they do 27. In the third set, they can only do 13 because they went to failure each time and they didn't adequately rest. Well, now, although they introduced volume and damage to the overall tissue, they didn't really tell their body what to get better at. They didn't give their body the optimal ability to perform the pattern and recover from the pattern to perform it again. So when you do that, you are not telling your body, hey, I want to get better at this. So for the most part, you want every set to be consistent with the amount of effort that you have. Did I answer your question, Sean, for you? Okay. Show you one more example. Once I get my mouse again. Other way. All right. Another example. So if you have an individual that wants to train strength, say their squat 1 rep max is 405 pounds, you'll see most of this looks exactly the same. You'll notice the rest is much higher. And you'll see that there's much fewer necessarily exercises that are going to correlate to this. Also, we're not necessarily training endurance as much on this as we were in the other piece or hypertrophy with this. So you see you have a high bar back squat at 4 rep max, RP of 9. We're getting into landmine deadlift, a front rack, which means kettlebell lunge, which means you're holding the weight in front of you at your collarbone, and then a backwards carry for a backwards farmer's carry with supinated grip. What do you think that relates to? What movement do we have to do where that would relate to? Think ACFT. Sprint dry carry. Good, sprint dry carry. In this case, you're trying to manage your posture, your ability to balance your posture while moving backwards in the saddle plane with that intensity. And it's a very coordinated movement, but that's why we need to train it, because it seems very odd and it'll feel awkward to do, but those odd movements that require a lot more coordination need to be trained more. Okay. Questions overall? All right, so let me change the screen that we are sharing. And bring this up on the projector. So as Sergeant Rodriguez brought up earlier, this is, and again, it looks like a lot, but this is the Excel sheet that I've created for us to be able to do all of this math easier for programming. So the way you'll see this is, these are your movement patterns, right? You notice that I have all of the primary lifts here. I've added trap bar deadlift, obviously because of ACFT, and it's very specific to our population. But you can change the name of this exercise to anything that you want. You want to be able to put what your 1 rep max is here. And of course, as I said earlier, you don't typically want to assess exactly at a 1 rep max. So say you went to the gym tomorrow and you wanted to find out what your overhead press 1 rep max was. You would come and you would use this Excel. Say you're able to do 95 pounds 10 times. So when you put in 95, it'll give you your approximate 1 rep max. You'd come over to overhead press, you'd put what that weight is for 1 rep max, and it's going to give you all of your percentages that you can train at. So if you go back to the training chart that we had earlier, if you wanted to warm up at 50% first, right? So you train at 65 pounds, then your next warm-up set could be 75 pounds for 60%. Next warm-up set could be 70% at 90 pounds, and then maybe you're working your 8 rep max, right? 80%, which would be 100 pounds. And here's where the chart I showed you earlier, which you can see what 80% is. 80% is 8 reps. Now, would it be advantageous for you to put 100 pounds in that bar and lift it 8 times for 5 sets if this was your true 8 rep max? So if 100 pounds is your 8 rep max, or 80%, would it be optimal for you to do all of your sets at 100 pounds?
Yes,
Why?
depending on the kind of goal you have.
So everything does depend on the goal. You're right there, but you want to keep in mind, we always want to train with how many repetitions in reserve? 1 to 2. So in this case, because the weight is so light, you notice that simply dropping 5 pounds already drops the percentage by almost 2 reps in reserve. Right? If it was a much heavier weight, then it wouldn't be the case. But if you were going to train at 8 reps and you just notice that your 8 repetition max is 100 pounds, it's more ideal for you to train at 95 pounds in order to keep those 2 reps in reserve. Because if you trained at 100 pounds, you may get your first set, but it'll be very unlikely that you'll get subsequent sets, right? Set 2 and 3 still at 8 repetitions because you're training at max effort. So you always want to keep those 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve. All right, so let's say you went in the gym, you trained deadlift, and you found your deadlift to be 275 pounds. Sorry for that. So you come over to deadlift, right? You put in, keep clicking the wrong button, 365 pounds as your approximate 1 rep max. Now you'll notice the difference in a 2 rep max between 80% and 75%, instead of being 5 pounds, is 15 pounds. So in this case, you have a lot longer range. You, instead of training at 290, you could train at 280. You could train at 285, right? You could train at 275, but you could train in between any of those in order to keep your repetitions in reserve. And you'd want to consistently increase every week in order to improve your overall progressive overload. But if you're not progressing either every week or every other week or as often as you can, then you're not really going to have positive adaptations. Now, the higher your training age, the more often you've trained, the less likely you're going to see adaptate, or the less likely you're going to be able to progress. If you've been doing deadlifts for years, you're not going to be able to put on 5 to 10 pounds per week. It's just not going to happen. But if you have an individual that's just starting, they'll be able to put on 5 to 10 pounds for the first 4 to 6 months. And that's a huge capacity for how much strength they can actually increase. Right. So this is how you can use this tool. This will give you all of your percentages. This chart gives you your approximation of 1 rep max. This will allow you to calculate your 1 rep max. I've put in some additional things to help you out. Right. So if you have the average body weight of a soldier at 180 pounds, right? Say they were a male, we'll put their age at 25, and we'll put their height at we'll say, I don't know, 68 inches. Okay. They can choose their activity level, how often they're going to be working out per week, and I put explanation in here. And their composition goal, right? Do they want to gain muscle, lose fat, or maintain? And it'll automatically calculate their energy requirements for nutrients as well, depending on their current composition. So they can use this Excel, and they can even put this Excel on their phone, and they can track their weight, they can track their goal, and they can track their 1 rep max in order to see their overall progress. You can put your goal, right? So say their current 1 rep max for deadlift is 365, and they want to be able to get to 400 pounds. Then this is going to say that they have about 35 pounds of work they need to be able to improve in order to get there. So as they're progressing, this is how much work they need to be able to overall improve for their 1 rep max. Your Wilks score, whether they're male or female, is your competitive score. As you saw last week when we talked about the Iron Soldier assessment, this tells you a correlation, coefficient value of how much they're able to lift compared to their body weight. So this is what norms people of different body weight lifting weight. So if you had a female at the same age, same height, same weight, she would get 149 points basically for this deadlift, where a male would only get 111 points. All right, so when we do the Iron Soldier assessment, this is where it'll even out for individuals based on biological sex. I've also added down here, to make things easier, chart for the macros, right? So it'll automatically calculate your protein needs based on what you put up there. It'll automatically calculate your fat needs based on what you put up there. And you can change carbohydrates to whatever percentage of your daily value you want, and everything else will modify. Lastly, if you just wanted to see like a warm-up percentage, say your 1 rep max was, what do we put for the deadlift? 365? For warm-up was, or excuse me, 1 rep max is 365, and you want to train at 69%, right? Something that's not an equal 7 or 0. It'll tell you how much weight you would need to be able to lift and how many approximate reps you'll need to be able to do, or you'll be able to do. All right, so it's already built in there for you. And I put the base resistance training pieces in there. So strength max effort for deadlift, if you wanted to train 3x3, which is approximately 93%, this is the weight they would need to lift, and this is the amount of rest that they would need to be able to perform. If you change that to the overhead press, which we also changed, you'll see that it'll automatically put their 93% as 115. Their dynamic effort, strength effort, and then hypertrophy, etc. Right? So it's one chart that kind of covers everything for the resistance training program we've already covered. They still need to be able to put this in some type of microcycle format because you still need to teach them how to program over time. But this tool allows you to have everything in one singular motion. Right? Any questions on this tool? Does it seem useful?
Absolutely. All right.
Thank you. Some additional pieces we have here. This would require several blocks of instruction in and of itself. So a holistic conditioning program is something of my own design. This, in my opinion, over working with tactical athletes for about the last decade and seeing what our overall movement patterns were, if you needed to generalize the best, in my opinion, type of training for overall tactical athletes, this is how I would break it down. And you'd read this by, I made it into 4 different blocks: an alpha block, Bravo block, Charlie, and Delta. So your alpha block are your warm-up. In this case, this would be a dynamic warm-up focusing on spine, hip, and shoulder, right? Our 3 primary athletic joints. You would do whatever general warm-up you'd want in order to get your heart rate zone to 3. Then you'd move into your Bravo block, which is a general physical preparedness, which is what you see here, type of warm-up. In this case, you'd be doing 25 minutes of as many reps as possible for your movements. And I've covered this before. I've worked with Sergeant Watts with this. It's called the winning warm-up. For your first exercise would be a weakness of your movement pattern. The second would be an antagonist of your movement pattern. And then third would be something that would prime the movement. Your third block would be your actual main activity. So if you're going to work on the speed of your movement, then your main activity would be dynamic focus, which means you'd be doing 10-minute EMOM at 3 reps of your 75% intensity. If you're doing max effort, that means you'd be doing 3x3 at 93. If you're doing stamina, you'd be doing 5x5 at 85. If you're doing endurance, it's literally just doing as many reps as you can in 5 minutes at 50%, and which this chart here automatically calculates for you. All right, so if you want to do your strength dynamic effort, 10x3 at an EMOM, you'd be doing it 255 if that was your 1 rep max. And your Delta block is your recovery block. I also put a cardiovascular session into here. So it works the same way. Cardiovascular, we work on our energy system. So either we're going to work on PCR, phosphocreatine, and alactic focus, which is your anaerobic threshold, aerobic focus, which is your aerobic threshold, and then stamina, which is your overall over distance. And then, of course, you would have your mobility and your cooldown. So this one chart, once you learn how to read it, in my opinion, covers everything a tactical athlete would need to do. Then you would just literally plug your exercise in and you have the same intensities over time as you progress with. If you want to focus on hypertrophy, so you want to look good, this is a consensus of most meta-analysis on what you need for hypertrophy. So you see all of these are hyperlinks. If you wanted to focus on a back group, you would click that hyperlink to get there. This tells you how many repetitions you'd want per set, how often you'd want to work it per week, and then the overall volume per week that you would want. If you're just trying to maintain what you have, so hypertrophy isn't your goal, you just want to maintain your muscle, somewhere between 0 and 8 sets of that back session. If you wanted to get your maximum adaptive volumes, the most amount of sets per that muscle group per week, and again, per week, would be 14 to 22 sets. So if on Monday you did chest day, right, International Chest Day, and you did 5 sets of bench on flat bench, and another 5 sets on incline, another 5 sets on decline, in that one day, you're already at 15 sets of bench, which means that you really only have 5 more sets of some type of chest movement you should be doing to reach your maximal adaptive recovery in a week. Very often people go far beyond what they need. And when they go beyond what they need, they're giving their body too much information and they can't recover from it. Okay, so you have your maintenance volume. What do you need to maintain? Minimum volume is the least amount you need to be able to do to maintain, or excuse me, to improve. Maximal is the maximum you should be able to do to improve. Maximum recoverable is if you wanted to push yourself to the absolute limit after you've been training for a while, you really shouldn't pass this amount of sets per week for hypertrophy. And then you'll see other charts on here as well for strength, for Westside Barbell, starting strength, Texas method, super squat program, and then I've added Smolov for squats. So these just give other training program examples to give someone places of where they can start if they wanted to improve, right? Already built in there for you.
That's for teams.
This is in Teams. I've added it to the chat for this. It's also in for CTAS. It's when there are PRTP, Physical Readiness Training Program, references under governance folder for things for you to be able to use. Questions so far? Yeah. Well, let me tie this together to our overall intent. For holistic health and fitness, for H2F, and therefore for CTAS, for us, for the comprehensive technical athlete system, what I need as a program manager from each of our CTAS professionals are to be able to understand program design enough to be able to teach it to the soldiers. The end state, once we get to phase 3 of CTAS, is that the squad leader or section leader is both teaching their soldiers program design and evaluating their soldiers' individual training programs. Phase 2, working backwards on this, phase 2 is that the platoon sergeant and first sergeant, through training from the CTAS member, understand program design enough to evaluate their squad leader / section leaders programs for each battle assembly. So as the squad leaders start understanding program design through our physical readiness training program policy, our brigade policy, every month, the squad / section leader should be presenting the next month's battle assembly training program for their squad to, right now, their CTAS member, but in the future to their platoon sergeant for evaluation before the end of that battle assembly. Right, so we have May battle assembly coming up. In that battle assembly, that squad / section leader should give their CTAS member or their platoon sergeant June's physical readiness training program for their squad or section, what they want to do, why they want to do it, and that platoon sergeant or CTAS member will evaluate it in order to teach them whatever their deficiencies are, and to fix it and give them the corrections. Then the following battle assembly, that's the exact training program that squad leader takes their squad through. So now, not only does the squad leader get practice in the program design so they can be able to teach their squad members, but the CTAS member and platoon sergeant gets practice evaluating programs, which is really how we learn, right, by teaching. And it also checks for efficacy. That way we make sure there's no suboptimal events going on. And this also reinforces what we've talked about before about every squad / section working independently, so that squad leader gets more leadership experience while training physically, and the program should still be matching the unit's overall meds. And then phase 1, which is what we're currently in, is me training you how to do it so you can learn to teach the platoon sergeants and first sergeants how to evaluate the squad leaders and section leaders. Do you see how that timeline kind of works? It is, it's going to take a lot of time, more time for some than others. My initial plan is for this phase 1 to take approximately 6 months. Right, so ideally, at least by October, we should have reinforced a few times those squad leaders developing some type of training program. There's going to be a lot of mistakes up first, but that's fine. Mistakes are how we learn. But that means that we shouldn't be waiting for August or September to have those squad leaders to start to design programs. We need to have them to start design programs now. So May battle assembly. Now, in order to do that, this is why I provided you resources, and I've already provided you programs. We're not just trying to develop something from scratch without knowledge. Have them develop something based off of the resources we have, right? You have FM 7-22 that teaches program design in less than 12 pages. Have them read that, have them go through that, have them develop a program and send it to you. If you don't know everything you're looking at, let me help you. So post it on our CTAS team page so everyone can see it in our team. That way, when I make corrections to it, not only do you learn individually, but everyone can see the before and after corrections. So everyone has a learning value from that. And then we try that every month moving forward, especially with all these annual trainings coming up. With annual training, you can have them practice this daily as they go through. That'll give you 2 weeks worth of program design practice, all the way up until this October program. All right, utilizing this chart or any other chart that you need. Okay. But that's the end state. That's what we need to start now to be able to get them through. And what I need you to understand so you know what your focus is. If you feel you are lost on program design, then you need to start looking into the material and asking me questions. Whether individually asking me questions or what my preferred method is asking questions on our CTAS team. That way, when I answer the questions, everyone can see the answer and it'll address multiple inquiries at once. Okay, but we're in phase 1 right now. I need you to start taxing those platoon sergeants, taxing your squad leaders and section leaders as much as we can. Any questions? All right, I'm gonna show one last thing and we're gonna stop this recording. This is the other resource that I put within the chat, and that's just the microcycle blank sheet, right? So I'm trying to use the same sheet that we use in Master Fitness course, because since I'm asking the CTAS members to be MFTs or to go MFT, I want to create a standardized process. So something that everyone is used to looking at. In the PowerPoint, you saw me use the same exact format for training programs. So in this case, you have whatever the goal of the day is, power, strength, endurance, etc. The warm-ups, the main activity, and the cool down. You have your overall volume, you have your overall intensity, your rest, and your RPE. So if we start using this to have our squad leaders put in their exercises for what they're going to do for their squad, then we evaluate it with this, everyone gets a learning value. We start doing it now so we can start preparing for October. Okay. All right. So in this lesson plan today, we've discussed some of the specifics of optimizing overall physical performance with regards to resistance training programming. We talked about what variables to consider for each day, right? When you're going to be moving weight, why it's kind of important to do that, and how we can kind of modify these variables to the individual's capacity, whether they're able to work out 2 times a week, 5 times a week, or what have you. At this point in time, do I have any questions on this lesson? Good. All right. So again, I thank you for coming in today for this clinic. On Thursday, we're going to be shifting our focus into HPOIP, which is our Human Performance Optimization and Injury Prevention Program. To make that short, the bottom line up front, that's our reconditioning program. So we're going to be talking about acute musculoskeletal injuries. What injuries are, what do we do when it happens, right? You're in the gym, you're out on the track, you feel that you've quote unquote pulled a muscle or tweaked a muscle. What should you or your soldiers do immediately within that training session and then moving forward in order to get better? As well as how can we look at our individuals on permanent profiles and help them mitigate their limitations in order to help them eventually remove that profile. All right. I thank you very much for coming to this clinic, and I will see you on Thursday.